Have you ever found yourself endlessly trying to win someone's attention? Maybe you've sent that extra message, waited by your phone, or replayed every conversation in your head, just hoping that somehow, this time, it'll work. But what if the very act of chasing is the reason you feel stuck? What if things actually start shifting the moment you stop trying so hard? Let's rewind to a story that might sound all too familiar. There's this person. You're drawn to them, almost magnetically. They're charming, a little mysterious, and just out of reach enough to keep you hooked. You start rearranging your schedule, overthinking texts, doing mental gymnastics just to interpret their mixed signals. And slowly your identity begins to revolve around the pursuit. You're no longer living for you. You're living for a response, for a maybe. Carl Jung believed that the things we chase often reveal more about our inner voids than they do about the people we desire. He said that, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And in relationships, this couldn't be more true. You see, when we're in that state of chasing, we're not really chasing them. We're chasing the parts of ourselves we feel we're missing. Validation, safety, a sense of being enough. And that chase becomes a performance, one that exhausts us emotionally while convincing us we need something or someone outside ourselves to feel whole. But what if that's the trap? Here's the paradox. The more desperately you chase, the further things seem to slip away. It's like trying to grab water. It just runs through your fingers. But then something happens. One day, you get tired. Not out of anger or resentment. Just tired. You stop reaching. You stop bending. You stop waiting. And in that pause, everything changes. Carl Jung didn't just study the human mind. He explored the forces beneath our behavior, especially the unconscious motives we often ignore. One of his most powerful ideas was that many of our pursuits are projections of the inner self. We chase people, situations, or dreams, not always because we genuinely want them, but because they reflect something unresolved within us. So when you stop chasing, what actually happens? First, you break the illusion that fulfillment lives outside you, that someone else holds the key to your peace. Then something subtle but powerful occurs. You begin to turn inward. You begin to notice your own energy. You ask different questions. Why do I feel unworthy unless I'm chosen? What part of me feels invisible when I'm not being pursued? These aren't easy questions, but they're real. And they're the beginning of self-awareness. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you start choosing yourself. And that's where the shift happens. In that space of detachment, you gain clarity. Suddenly, you're not anxiously analyzing someone else's behavior. You're observing your own patterns. You're not waiting for love. You're cultivating it within. And the beauty is, when you let go of the chase, you open up room for what's meant for you to actually find you. It sounds simple, but it's powerful. And it's supported not just by Jung's insights, but by years of psychological research. Studies in behavioral psychology show how our minds are wired to seek rewards, especially intermittent ones, the kind that keep us hooked without giving us real satisfaction. It's why inconsistent affection can be more addictive than consistent love. But detachment interrupts that loop. It rewires the pattern. This video is about that shift, from chasing to choosing, from projection to reflection, and most importantly, from emotional dependence to emotional growth. So if you've been stuck in that loop, always reaching but never feeling enough, this is your moment. Not to chase harder, but to pause, to look inward. Because sometimes when you stop chasing, you don't lose anything. You finally find yourself. The unconscious quest. Why we chase what eludes us. There's a strange irony in human behavior. Often the more distant or unavailable something is, the more desperately we want it. And this isn't just some poetic heartbreak scenario. It's rooted in the very way our minds are wired. The question is, why? Why do we chase what pulls away? And more importantly, what does that say about us? Carl Jung believed that the chase is rarely about the object of our desire. It's about our internal search for something lost, something fragmented inside us. When we feel emotionally incomplete or insecure, we tend to project those feelings outward. Suddenly, it's not about healing our inner world. It's about finding someone who can fix it for us. But that never really works, does it? From a behavioral psychology perspective, this loop makes a lot of sense. B.F. Skinner's work on operant conditioning showed that unpredictable rewards, like inconsistent affection, are the most powerful at reinforcing behavior. Think about it. If someone responds to your affection only sometimes, your brain doesn't disengage. It gets more hooked. It keeps trying, chasing, hoping the reward will come again. That's why situationships and vague emotional connections can feel so intense. They're not nourishing, they're just neurologically addictive. This phenomenon is mirrored in cognitive psychology through mental shortcuts called heuristics. One of the most relevant here is the scarcity heuristic. The brain assumes that if something is hard to get, it must be valuable. So when someone becomes emotionally distant, our minds unconsciously label them as more worthy, more important. But this is rarely the truth. It's just an illusion built by a survival-focused brain trying to reduce uncertainty. Jung's concept of projection adds even more layers. He argued that what we see in others is often a reflection of our unmet needs or unresolved pain. When we chase someone who doesn't fully reciprocate, it might not be because they're the right one. It's because they mirror our inner voids. Maybe they reflect the parent who withheld love. Maybe they resemble the dream of finally being chosen. But in reality, we're seeking wholeness through someone else's presence. A powerful insight comes from the lesser-known book In Search of the Self, Behavioral Insights Beyond Conscious Pursuit. It explores how much of our decision-making in relationships is based not on clarity, but on deficit. It describes cases where individuals, even those who are highly self-aware, keep repeating attachment patterns that trace back to early childhood conditioning, especially when emotional expression was punished or ignored. And it's not just theory. There was an experiment conducted at Stanford University that tested people's reactions to intermittent versus consistent rewards in interpersonal exchanges. The group exposed to inconsistent signals reported significantly more preoccupation, emotional volatility, and compulsive thoughts about their partner. In contrast, those with consistent interaction patterns had greater emotional regulation and less anxiety. All of this paints a pretty clear picture. The chase often begins when our unconscious mind believes we need something out there to fix what's in here. But the very act of chasing often distracts us from doing the one thing that actually helps, turning inward. We start performing for someone else's approval, instead of asking ourselves why that approval feels like a lifeline. Jung once noted, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." That's what the chase can become. A beautiful distraction from the hard work of self-awareness. So what if we flip the script? What if instead of chasing what eludes us, we started exploring what we've been avoiding within us? What patterns are driving your attachments? What old scripts are still playing in the background of your mind? The pursuit of someone else can be a smokescreen for the deeper pursuit we've been neglecting. the pursuit of understanding who we really are beneath all the longing. And the moment we stop looking outward for completion and start getting curious about our inner world, that's when the real transformation begins. Mirrors and projections, reflecting the hidden self. There's a strange and powerful truth about human relationships. We often don't see the other person as they are. We see them as we are. This is what Carl Jung called projection, and it might just be one of the most revealing and uncomfortable truths about why we chase people, ideas, or outcomes that never really serve us. So, what is projection really? Jung explained it as the unconscious act of attributing parts of ourselves, especially the ones we don't want to accept, to someone else. Think of it like holding up a mirror, but not realizing you're looking at your own reflection. You meet someone, and suddenly they seem magnetic, irresistible, even a little dangerous. But what you're feeling may have less to do with them, and more to do with what they trigger inside you. In dark psychology, projection is one of the most common forms of self-sabotage. You might, for example, blame someone else for being emotionally unavailable, when in reality, you haven't yet made space for vulnerability within yourself. Or maybe you keep falling for emotionally distant partners because deep down you fear real intimacy, yet you've masked that fear with the fantasy of chasing connection. Carl Jung believed that we all have a shadow, the parts of ourselves we push into the unconscious because they feel too uncomfortable, too shameful, or too painful to face. And projections are often born from that shadow. So when someone evokes a strong emotional reaction in you, especially one that feels irrational or obsessive, it's worth asking, what part of me are they reflecting? Research backs this up. A study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology showed that individuals often project their own undesirable traits onto others in high-stress or emotionally charged situations. In relationships, this creates a dynamic where we're not really interacting with the person. We're interacting with our idea of them. And that idea is shaped by old wounds, unmet needs, and unspoken fears. A fascinating read on this is Projection Unveiled, a deep dive into inner reflection, which explores how the unconscious mind filters and reframes our emotional experiences through others. It argues that when we feel drawn to someone in a way that feels overwhelming or unexplainable, it's often because they represent a part of us we've abandoned. Maybe they remind us of the boldness we suppress, the independence we crave, or even the chaos we secretly fear we contain. Think about that for a moment. How many times have you looked back on a relationship and thought, what was I thinking? Chances are, you weren't thinking. You were projecting. You were trying to reclaim something you couldn't face within yourself. This doesn't mean relationships are illusions or that feelings aren't real. It means that the intensity we feel is sometimes a psychological mirror trying to tell us something important about our inner landscape. Freud once said, "We are never so defenseless against suffering as when we love." But Jung might have added, especially when we're loving our projections. Because as long as we're unaware of what we're projecting, we'll keep chasing ghosts, falling in love with the illusion of someone who fills a gap we refuse to name. That's where the real work begins, not in changing who we're attracted to, but in becoming more aware of the why. Why do we seek certain traits? Why do some people feel like home, even when they hurt us? Why do we ignore red flags and romanticize inconsistency? When we start exploring these questions, we begin peeling back the projections, and what's underneath is often messy, raw, and vulnerable. But it's also where true self-awareness lives. And only when we become aware of our projections can we begin to form connections that are grounded, not in fantasy, but in truth. So the next time someone pulls you in with inexplicable force, pause. Ask yourself, what are they showing me about me? That one question can reveal a universe of insight about the hidden self we've been running from and the power we've been chasing all along. The collective unconscious, beyond personal scripts. Sometimes we think our choices in love, our patterns of attachment, and even the type of people we're drawn to are completely personal, unique to our own life stories. But Carl Jung had a radically different idea. He believed that much of what we do in relationships doesn't come from our individual histories alone, but from something far bigger, the collective unconscious. What is the collective unconscious? Jung described it as a deep psychological reservoir that holds the shared memories, symbols, and instincts of all humanity. It's where myths, archetypes, and inherited emotional patterns live. And whether we realize it or not, they shape how we seek love, how we handle rejection, and even how we chase. Take a moment to think about the love stories we're raised on. Fairy tales, movies, religious texts. They all echo similar scripts. The noble pursuit, the dramatic rescue, the belief that true love is something we must earn or fight for. These aren't just stories, they're imprints. Cultural downloads that influence the way our unconscious mind understands attachment. The moment we start believing that love equals struggle, or that being chosen equals worth, we enter a psychological script that often repeats across generations. Social psychology shows us that humans are wired to conform to group norms, and when those norms are rooted in unrealistic or idealized portrayals of love, we start chasing illusions. Developmental psychology also tells us that from childhood, we absorb behaviors from our environment without questioning them. If your parents' dynamic was based on pursuit and avoidance, or emotional dependency, your brain may have stored that as normal. A powerful book that examines this from a psychological lens is Collective Shadows: The Unseen Influence on Human Behavior. It explores how inherited emotional patterns influence everything from attraction to detachment. One key insight is how people in completely different cultures exhibit similar attachment behaviors, not because of their personal experiences, but because of archetypes shared through stories, religion, and generational conditioning. One fascinating experiment, led by Dr. Shinobu Kitayama, studied how romantic attachment varied across different cultures. Surprisingly, despite vast cultural differences, individuals still gravitated toward similar behavioral scripts, like idealizing distant partners or suppressing personal needs to maintain harmony. The takeaway: these tendencies aren't just about upbringing, they're embedded in a deeper layer of the psyche. Jung believed that archetypes like the lover, the hero, and the orphan are internal forces we unconsciously act out. So when you're drawn to someone who seems emotionally unavailable, it might not just be about them. It could be your inner orphan seeking rescue, or your hero self trying to prove you're worthy of love. And as long as those archetypes remain unconscious, they keep running the show. Philosophers like Marcus Aurelius and Confucius spoke of inherited wisdom and the importance of reflection in breaking cycles. Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That insight pairs perfectly with Jung's notion of becoming aware of the collective forces acting through us. Breaking free from these emotional scripts doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with awareness. Ask yourself, is this desire mine? Or was it given to me by a story I never questioned? Am I pursuing a person, or am I reenacting a myth I've internalized? When you stop seeing your patterns as personal failures and start seeing them as unconscious echoes of collective beliefs, you open the door to transformation. You begin to write your own story, one that isn't dictated by cultural fantasies or inherited fears. And here's the quiet revolution. When you stop chasing love based on someone else's script, you begin to create space for something real, something rooted in awareness, not compulsion. That's when attachment shifts into choice. And that's when love stops being a hunt and becomes something whole, grounded, and conscious. Individuation and self-love. Choosing yourself first. There's a moment in everyone's life when the chase becomes unbearable. Not because the object of your desire disappears, but because you finally realize you've disappeared in the process. That's where the journey of individuation begins. And to Carl Jung, this wasn't just a fancy psychological term. It was the most important mission of your life, becoming who you truly are. Individuation is the process of integrating all parts of yourself, your desires, fears, strengths, flaws, into one whole, authentic being. It's about peeling off the roles, the masks, and the projections that have been layered onto you by family, culture, or even your past relationships. And at the heart of individuation, choosing yourself. For many people, the idea of self-love sounds like self-indulgence. But in psychology, particularly existential and personality psychology, it's the opposite. It's self-responsibility. Viktor Frankl, the existential psychologist and Holocaust survivor, said that life is never made unbearable by circumstances, but only by a lack of meaning and purpose. And when we chase others, we're often trying to borrow their meaning. We want them to make us feel whole, special, validated. But that's never their job. It's ours. In Carl Rogers' work on person-centered therapy, he emphasized the importance of unconditional positive regard, not just from others, but from within. When you accept yourself fully, when you stop abandoning your own needs to be loved, you begin to radiate something powerful. Not desperation, not lack, but presence. And presence is magnetic in a way chasing never will be. One of the most insightful books that captures this inner journey is Individuation, Breaking Free from the Inner Script. It lays out how so many of us follow invisible psychological scripts, ways of behaving that were written not by us, but by early experiences, outdated beliefs, or unhealed emotional wounds. One case it highlights is that of a woman who constantly found herself in relationships where she gave everything and received little. After years of repeating this cycle, she realized she was chasing partners who echoed her childhood dynamic, seeking love by overperforming. Her turning point wasn't finding the right partner. It was finally choosing herself, redefining her worth, and rewriting the script. Psychologically, this shift is profound. Self-love activates neural circuits associated with reward, motivation, and emotional regulation. Research from the University of Texas found that individuals who engage in daily self-affirmation show significantly increased activity in the brain's ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region tied to self-value and resilience. In simple terms, when you consistently choose yourself, your brain rewires to support that inner confidence. Ancient wisdom echoes the same truth. Lao Tzu said, "He who conquers others is strong. He who conquers himself is mighty." The chase is about conquering others. Individuation is about returning to the self. And it's only when we stop trying to win love that we learn to become it. So what does it mean to choose yourself? It means you stop settling for relationships that drain you just because they offer brief moments of attention. It means you stop ignoring your gut just to stay connected. It means you no longer abandon your truth just to be accepted. It means that instead of asking, "How can I make them stay?" you start asking, "Does this honor who I really am?" And when you choose yourself, not just in words but in action, you'll notice something incredible. The right people don't need to be chased. The right energy doesn't feel like war. You'll attract what's meant for you, not by grasping, but by being. Because when you stop chasing love and start becoming it, everything begins to shift. You no longer seek to be chosen. You realize you've already been chosen by the most important person in your life, you. Facing the shadow, embracing the parts we hide. There's a part of you you've been avoiding. We all have it. It's the part that feels unworthy, angry, jealous, or afraid. It's the voice that whispers, "You're not good enough," or the impulse that sabotages what you actually want. Carl Jung called this the shadow, not because it's evil, but because it's hidden. It's the side of us we've pushed into the unconscious because somewhere along the way, we were taught it wasn't acceptable. Here's the thing. The more we avoid the shadow, the louder it becomes. And when it's ignored, it shows up in ways we don't always notice. Chasing emotionally unavailable people, starting arguments when things feel too good, clinging to relationships that keep us small. Shadow behaviors are rarely obvious. They sneak in through the back door of our unconscious and play out in subtle but powerful ways. Clinical psychology and psychoanalysis both confirm this. Unacknowledged emotional wounds have a funny way of expressing themselves in compulsions, emotional reactivity, and relationship sabotage. One 2017 study from the Journal of Behavioral Therapy found that individuals with unresolved emotional repression exhibited significantly more anxiety and difficulty with emotional regulation in romantic relationships. In other words, what we don't face controls us. Jung's entire model of healing revolved around the idea that true wholeness comes not from being perfect, but from becoming conscious of everything we are, especially the parts we reject. He believed that the journey to inner freedom begins when we stop pretending, when we stop wearing masks to appear lovable, and start being honest about what lies underneath. Shadow work is the process of getting curious about those hidden parts. And it's not some mystical concept, it's practical psychology. It's asking yourself hard questions like, why did I overreact just now? What am I avoiding by chasing someone else's attention? What pain am I afraid to feel if I let go? When you ask these kinds of questions, you shine a light on the unconscious and begin reclaiming the power it's been holding. The book, Meeting the Shadow, The Hidden Layers of the Mind, offers an incredible look into this process. Drawing from the work of therapists like Connie Zweig and Jeremiah Abrams, it explores how many of our unconscious patterns are formed in early life, not because we're broken, but because we were trying to survive. A child who was told their anger was bad learns to suppress it, and as an adult, they become overly accommodating in relationships. A person who wasn't heard as a child might become addicted to being chosen, just to feel seen. When these patterns run unchecked, they shape our identity without our permission. But when we bring them into awareness, something amazing happens. We get to choose. Not react, not chase, not collapse, but choose. Modern neuroscience backs this up. When we engage in reflective practices, like journaling, therapy, or even mindfulness, our brain's medial prefrontal cortex becomes more active. That's the part responsible for introspection and emotional understanding. This kind of self-inquiry actually rewires your brain to pause, reflect, and respond more thoughtfully, breaking old loops of emotional reactivity and impulsive behavior. Facing the shadow also means taking back your projections. It means realizing that the traits you hate in others often mirror traits you haven't made peace with in yourself. That the emotional highs and lows in toxic attachments aren't just about the other person, they're revealing something about you. And that's not shameful, it's empowering. Because the moment you stop running from your own darkness, it stops controlling you. You realize the parts of you that were too much, too needy, or too intense were never the problem. They were just unacknowledged. And when you embrace them with compassion, not judgment, you begin the process of true integration. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." This is the work. It's not always easy, but it is freeing. Because the more of yourself you reclaim, the less you need from others. And when you stop seeking completion in someone else's arms, you finally discover what it means to be whole, right here, within your own. Synchronicity and alignment. When the universe speaks. Have you ever let go of someone, finally stopped obsessing, and suddenly, out of nowhere, they reached out? Or maybe the moment you stopped chasing a goal, a new opportunity appeared that felt strangely perfect. These aren't just random events. Carl Jung called this phenomenon synchronicity, when meaningful coincidences seem to align with your inner state. And when you begin to detach from desperation, that's often when these moments show up. Synchronicity isn't magic in the fantasy sense. It's deeply tied to brain science and psychology. When we're constantly in a state of chasing, whether it's love, approval, or validation, our brains are locked into stress mode. The amygdala is overactive, the prefrontal cortex gets clouded, and we miss things. We overlook subtle cues. We ignore opportunities that don't match what we think we want. But when we release that tight grip on outcome, the brain shifts. We become more open, more observant. Our perception expands. In cognitive neuroscience, this is explained through a shift in attentional networks. Studies have shown that when individuals practice emotional release or detachment, there's increased activity in brain regions related to insight and problem solving. We literally start seeing things we couldn't before, not because the world changed, but because we did. This is the beauty of alignment. When your inner world is no longer ruled by fear or frantic pursuit, you start noticing people, ideas, and opportunities that resonate with your true self, not your anxious self. And these moments often feel uncanny. Jung believed this wasn't accidental. He suggested that the unconscious mind connects with the external world in symbolic, synchronistic ways. When you're aligned within, the outer world seems to mirror that back to you. One incredible book that explores this is Synchronicity and the Self, The Art of Meaningful Coincidences. It shares stories and case studies from therapy sessions where clients experienced breakthrough moments, often after releasing attachments. One example describes a man who stopped pursuing a toxic relationship and, within weeks, met someone who reflected the exact qualities he'd been yearning for, but had overlooked while caught in the wrong dynamic. These aren't miracles. They're reflections of a real psychological shift. Neuropsychologist Dr. Richard Davidson's research shows that emotional regulation and mindfulness practices can alter the brain's default mode network, essentially the internal chatter that fuels anxious attachments. When this network quiets, we become more present, and in that presence, synchronicity becomes visible. Jung believed that the world is not as random as we think. He wrote, "Synchronicity is an ever-present reality for those who have eyes to see." but it requires a kind of inner stillness, a space created when you stop clinging. And that's where letting go becomes an active force, not a passive surrender. It's not giving up, it's aligning. Ancient thinkers like the Stoics also pointed to this. Marcus Aurelius said, "What stands in the way becomes the way." Sometimes the obstacle is our own obsession. And when we remove it, a new path unfolds, not forced but found. When you detach, you're not withdrawing from life, you're tuning into it more clearly. You stop trying to force connections and instead allow them to arise naturally. You stop chasing signs and start seeing them everywhere. You trust that what's meant for you doesn't need to be dragged into your life. It arrives when you're finally ready to receive it. So if you've been holding on, waiting, pushing, try this. Let go, not with bitterness, but with trust. Trust in your growth. Trust in your awareness. Trust in the idea that the universe, or your own unconscious, will respond when you're aligned. Because when you stop needing everything to work out your way, you create space for something far better. Synchronicity. And in that space, everything really does begin to change. The price of dependency. Unmasking the danger of the chase. Let's talk about something most people avoid admitting: emotional dependency. It often hides behind words like loyalty, love, or devotion, but at its core, it's a form of addiction. Not to a person necessarily, but to what that person represents. And when dependency creeps in, the chase becomes more than a habit. It becomes a psychological trap that's hard to escape. Carl Jung warned us that what we fail to make conscious will rule our lives. Dependency is one of those unseen forces. It feels like love, but it's often rooted in fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of loneliness, fear of not being enough on your own. And when fear drives attachment, it warps our ability to choose clearly. It turns desire into obsession and affection into bargaining. From a dark psychology standpoint, dependency creates fertile ground for manipulation. The more emotionally dependent you are, the easier it is for someone to control you, whether they mean to or not. Subtle behaviors like breadcrumbing, gaslighting, and emotional withholding become devastating because they hit right at the core of your self-worth. You start bending, twisting, even abandoning your values just to keep the connection alive. Forensic behavioral analysis has explored how emotional dependency can lead to dangerous cycles, especially when paired with manipulative dynamics. Research from the Journal of Interpersonal Violence highlighted that individuals with high dependency traits were more likely to remain in toxic or abusive relationships, often rationalizing their partner's behavior as love or passion. The truth. Dependency clouds judgment and masks red flags. One powerful book that explores this is Dependency, Desire, and Detachment: The Neuroscience of Relationships. It explains how the brain builds circuits around emotional habits, especially when strong emotions like longing and fear are involved. Dopamine, the chemical linked to reward, is heavily involved in romantic pursuit. The chase lights it up, reinforcing behaviors, even when they hurt. It becomes a cycle: anxiety, temporary connection, relief, and then back to anxiety. Neurologically, this is how addiction works, and emotional dependency can hijack the same neural pathways. When you depend on someone else to feel good, safe, or whole, your brain treats their attention like a drug. When it's there, you're high. When it's gone, you crash. And you chase, not because it's love, but because your system is starving. Carl Rogers spoke about the danger of conditions of worth. When you believe you must meet certain criteria to be lovable. Dependency is often born here. Somewhere along the way, you were taught that you had to earn love, that being chosen made you valuable. And when someone seems just out of reach, your nervous system lights up. Not because it's right, but because it feels familiar. This is why detachment is so powerful. It breaks the pattern. It creates space between you and the compulsion. It allows you to witness the behavior instead of being consumed by it. Jung believed that freedom comes from awareness, not control. And when you become aware of the psychological cost of the chase, you stop glamorizing it. You stop calling it passion when it's actually panic. You stop mistaking chaos for chemistry. It's not that love is bad, it's that dependency in disguise is dangerous, because it doesn't just affect your relationships, it affects your identity. It makes you forget who you are when you're not chasing someone else's approval. And here's the quiet truth most people never say out loud. Sometimes the most powerful act of love isn't staying. It's stepping back. It's saying, I will not trade my peace for permission to matter to you. You don't have to chase to be worthy. You don't have to suffer to be seen. And the moment you stop depending on someone else to validate your existence, you begin to reclaim your power, piece by piece, breath by breath. That's not rejection, that's transformation. Dark reflections, the illusion of pursuit in the realm of dark psychology. There's a darker side to the chase that most people never realize until they're already caught in it. It's not just about longing or desire. It's about control, influence, even mind games. And sometimes the thing we're chasing isn't love at all. It's an illusion carefully shaped by our own unconscious triggers, and at times, someone else's manipulative tactics. Dark psychology refers to the subtle yet powerful ways people use influence, persuasion, and emotional manipulation to get what they want, often without the other person ever realizing it. It operates in the shadows of the human mind, targeting our fears, our hopes, and our unresolved emotional wounds. And when we're emotionally vulnerable, like in the middle of a chase, we're at our most suggestible. Carl Jung's idea of the unconscious self fits perfectly here. When we're not aware of our internal patterns, we become highly susceptible to people who mirror our unhealed wounds. They seem irresistible, not because they're healthy or even good for us, but because they activate something familiar, something broken, something we unconsciously seek to resolve through them. This is where self-sabotage enters the picture. In dark psychology, the illusion of pursuit is sustained by familiar pain. You chase someone who gives you just enough attention to keep you hooked, but not enough to feel secure. Your nervous system becomes locked into a cycle of highs and lows, longing and withdrawal. It feels intense, but it's not love. It's emotional survival masquerading as romance. Behavioral research has shown that intermittent reinforcement, the unpredictable reward system often used in gambling, is the same psychological mechanism at play in toxic or manipulative relationship dynamics. It's how emotional manipulators gain control. The inconsistency keeps you guessing, and in guessing, you get stuck. One of the most unsettling but insightful texts on this is The Dark Mirror. Manipulation, influence, and the hidden self. It explores real-life case studies where emotional manipulation created strong dependency loops. Not because the victims were weak, but because their unresolved inner narratives made them the perfect match for toxic patterns. One story recounts a man who repeatedly found himself attracted to emotionally cold partners. He wasn't unlucky. He was acting out a script where emotional rejection felt like home. The illusion of pursuit made him feel alive, even though it was slowly draining his sense of self. In many ways, These cycles are hypnotic. Not in the mystical sense, but in the psychological one. Hypnosis and suggestibility studies reveal that we're most mentally pliable when we're emotionally overwhelmed. So when you're caught in the chase, full of anxiety, hope, longing, you're not just vulnerable emotionally, you're vulnerable cognitively. And those moments are exactly when manipulation thrives. Psychologists like Robert Cialdini, who studied the science of influence, found that people are more likely to comply with requests or emotional cues when under pressure or in emotionally uncertain situations. In relationships, this can look like love bombing, guilt trips, or inconsistent validation, all tools of unconscious coercion. But here's the truth. We don't just fall for manipulation because others are cunning. We fall for it because parts of us still believe we deserve the struggle, that we have to earn affection, that we must perform to be enough. These aren't random thoughts. They're the voice of the shadow. And until we confront that voice, we'll keep replaying the same illusion, chasing ghosts instead of grounding in reality. Jung said, "Your visions will become clear only when you can look into your own heart." The illusion of pursuit fades the moment you turn inward, when you begin to question why chaos feels so familiar, when you stop trying to decode someone else and start decoding yourself. Because once you understand your patterns, you stop being controlled by them. You stop being baited by silence, lured by emotional unavailability, or trapped by your own projections. You begin to see clearly. And when you see clearly, the illusion falls apart. That's not just power, that's freedom. And it starts with the question, what part of me keeps chasing what hurts? Neural pathways of detachment, letting go, rewiring the brain. Letting go isn't just a decision, it's a neurological transformation. When you stop chasing someone or something that's emotionally draining, it may feel like you're giving up, but in reality, you're reprogramming your brain. You're creating entirely new neural pathways that shift the way you think, feel, and relate to the world around you. Carl Jung often emphasized that transformation begins the moment we stop identifying with our compulsions. Detachment, in this sense, isn't coldness, it's clarity. It's the ability to observe your emotions without being consumed by them. And this clarity, as modern neuroscience shows, is not just a mental state. It's a biological process. When you're stuck in emotional pursuit, your brain is dominated by stress chemicals, particularly cortisol and adrenaline. These chemicals keep your body in fight or flight mode, which is great for escaping physical danger, but terrible for long-term emotional health. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reason, planning, and emotional regulation, starts to shut down under stress. That's why chasing feels chaotic. It actually is, at the brain level. But when you practice detachment, something powerful happens. The brain begins to calm. Cortisol levels drop. Dopamine, which was once chasing reward through someone else's approval, starts getting rerouted into self-directed rewards: rest, reflection, creation, peace. This shift is known as neural rewiring, or more technically, neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. A compelling book that explores this science is Neural Detachment, the science behind emotional release. It draws from fMRI studies showing that individuals who regularly practice self-reflection and mindfulness, tools of detachment, experience measurable changes in brain structure. The anterior cingulate cortex, which regulates emotional conflict, becomes more active. The default mode network, associated with rumination and self-criticism, becomes quieter. In other words, the very act of releasing someone emotionally changes the way your brain functions. One specific experiment from the University of Wisconsin studied the effects of letting go practices on emotional reactivity. Participants who engaged in detachment-focused meditation for just 2 weeks showed significant reductions in amygdala activation, the brain's alarm center, when exposed to emotional triggers. That means their brains became less reactive, more balanced, more grounded. But here's the deeper truth. Letting go isn't just about moving on from someone else. It's about coming home to yourself. It's about training your brain to stop outsourcing emotional regulation to another person. Instead of needing someone's attention to feel okay, you build internal mechanisms of calm, safety, and worth. Psychologist Daniel Goleman, known for his work on emotional intelligence, explained that self-awareness is the foundation for emotional mastery. And self-awareness grows strongest, not in the heat of reaction, but in the stillness of detachment. That's when you notice your thought patterns. That's when you start asking, why am I triggered? Instead of, how can I make them stay? Even ancient philosophy caught onto this long before brain scans confirmed it. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." That's the essence of rewiring, recognizing that your power lies not in controlling others, but in transforming your response to them. So what does this look like in practice? It might be choosing silence instead of sending that third text. It might be breathing through discomfort instead of running from it. It might be journaling your pain instead of projecting it onto someone else. These aren't small things. They are acts of neurological and emotional self-respect. Every time you choose self-regulation over reaction, you strengthen the brain's pathways of resilience. You're literally reshaping your inner landscape, and the more you do it, the more natural it becomes. That's what real freedom looks like. Not being unmoved, but being unshaken. Knowing you can feel deeply, love freely, and still walk away when something doesn't nourish your peace. Because letting go is not about loss. It's about neural alignment with your highest self. And when your brain learns that peace is within, not in someone else's hands, everything begins to change. Emotional intelligence and authentic growth. Evolving through self-awareness. There comes a point when you realize it's not about them, it's about you. Not in a selfish way, but in the most honest, self-responsible way possible. You begin to understand that chasing, clinging, or overanalyzing someone else is often just a distraction from the one relationship you've been neglecting, the one with yourself. And that's where emotional intelligence steps in, not as a trendy phrase, but as a life-changing practice. Emotional intelligence is your ability to recognize, understand, and manage your own emotions, while also being aware of how others feel. But here's what most people miss. It's not just about being calm or positive. It's about being real. It's about being willing to sit with your discomfort instead of projecting it. It's about responding rather than reacting. And that kind of growth can only happen when you stop running from your inner world. Carl Jung believed that self-awareness is the cornerstone of personal transformation. He emphasized that unless we become conscious of our inner patterns, we'll spend our lives being ruled by them, thinking it's fate. When you stop chasing others and start paying attention to your own emotional responses, you begin decoding the unconscious scripts you've been living out for years. One of the most transformative tools in this process is reflective journaling. Not the kind where you just vent, but the kind where you ask real questions. What am I feeling right now, and why? What part of me feels unseen? What am I hoping to get from them that I'm not giving myself? These questions open doors into the subconscious, and the more honest you are, the more clarity you gain. There's a brilliant book that ties together emotional intelligence and psychological healing, Resilience Through Reflection, Emotional Intelligence in Modern Psychology. It highlights how self-awareness isn't just about emotional control. It's about emotional integration. Real growth happens when you stop labeling your feelings as good or bad and start seeing them as information. Anxiety tells you where you're feeling unsafe. Jealousy points to buried insecurities. Anger often masks pain. When you listen, really listen, you gain insight. And insight leads to freedom. From a therapeutic standpoint, this is one of the key principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. Aaron Beck and Albert Ellis, two pioneers of CBT, taught that our thoughts shape our emotions, and our emotions shape our behavior. If you want to change your relationships, you don't start with the other person. You start with your thoughts. I need them to choose me becomes, why don't I feel chosen on my own? That's where the healing begins. Emotional intelligence also builds what psychologists call distress tolerance, the ability to sit with uncomfortable feelings without acting on them impulsively. This is a major milestone in personal growth. Because when you can sit with your loneliness, sadness, or fear without reaching for a quick fix, be it texting someone, overworking, or numbing out, you reclaim power over your inner state. And that's when authentic relationships begin to form, not from a place of need, but from a place of wholeness. There's a famous quote by Daniel Goleman. In a very real sense, we have two minds, one that thinks and one that feels. When these two parts aren't communicating, we get stuck in loops of impulsive behavior and emotional chaos. But when they begin working together, when self-awareness bridges that gap, your decisions become intentional. You start choosing peace over drama, truth over ego, growth over gratification. And you don't have to do this perfectly. Growth is messy. You'll still get triggered. You'll still fall into old patterns sometimes. But each time you notice, each time you pause, reflect, and choose differently, you strengthen the connection to your inner self. So if you've been chasing someone who doesn't see you, maybe it's time to ask, have I truly seen myself? Have I honored my own emotional needs? Have I treated myself the way I hope to be treated by others? Because the truth is, when you develop emotional intelligence, you stop chasing people who can't meet you. Not out of anger, not out of pride, but out of respect for the version of you that's finally waking up. And that version? They're not desperate. They're deliberate. And they're ready for something real. Awaken within, your journey to authentic love. There's a quiet turning point in this journey when you stop asking, why don't they love me the way I want? And begin asking, why have I forgotten how to love myself? That's when something inside you shifts. Not with fanfare or dramatic declarations, but in a quiet, steady return to your own center. This is where the chase ends, and something far more powerful begins. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." And maybe that's been the real lesson all along, that the people we chase, the outcomes we obsess over, the validation we think we need, they've just been mirrors. Mirrors reflecting the parts of ourselves that have been calling out to be noticed, nurtured, and reclaimed. Throughout this journey, we've looked at the hidden drivers of our behavior, projection theory, emotional dependency, the dark tactics of manipulation, and the brain science behind detachment. But here's the thread running through it all: awareness. Awareness is the light that reveals the trap of the chase. It's the insight that transforms anxiety into clarity, confusion into peace. True love, real, grounded, lasting love, doesn't come from performing, pleading, or proving. It doesn't come from chasing someone until they finally see you. It comes from choosing yourself, from doing the work to heal your inner world so you can stop projecting your wounds onto others, from building the emotional resilience to walk away from what dims your light, no matter how much your heart wants to stay. Because here's the truth. When you become whole, you stop seeking someone else to complete you. When you become aware, you stop confusing chaos with connection. And when you choose yourself, the need to chase fades. Not because you don't care anymore, but because you finally care enough. Enough to know your peace matters. Enough to know your worth isn't up for negotiation. Enough to trust that what's meant for you will meet you where you are, not require you to shrink, beg, or break yourself to fit. And the beauty of this shift? It doesn't just change your relationships, it changes how you walk through life. You start attracting people who meet you in your wholeness, not your wounding. You begin forming connections based on mutual respect, emotional maturity, and authentic presence. You don't need to chase love when you are love. When your self-awareness becomes your anchor, you move through life with quiet confidence. You trust the timing, trust the flow, and most importantly, trust yourself. So take a moment, breathe, reflect. You've come far. You've questioned the old stories. You've faced your shadow. You've begun to rewire your mind, your heart, and your patterns. That's not small. That's everything. Now here's your invitation. Continue the journey inward. Keep asking the hard questions. Keep honoring the answers. If you feel moved, write down the patterns you've uncovered. Start a journal. Share your story in the comments below. Not for attention, but for connection. You're not alone. There's a whole community of people waking up to the same truth. Remember, the end of the chase is not the end of love. It's the beginning of real love. Love that doesn't demand you lose yourself. Love that honors your essence. Love that flows from the inside out. Because once you stop chasing, you start choosing. And that choice, your choice, changes everything. You've looked inside. You've awakened. Now let that awareness guide every relationship, every moment, every step forward. You are enough. You always have been. And your journey to authentic love begins within.